Start recording. Okay. So let's open up a scene. I'm gonna go to scenes and I'll use my default scene. And so what I want to do is add in a couple rewards for the character to pick up. We don't have a tile set in here, so let me just add one real quick. Add a tile map. And I'm going to drag it up here a bit, and I'll go ahead and just load my, I'm going to use the regular 3x3 here, and let's just give the character some stuff to walk around. Just fill in all this stuff, and let's turn on Y sort. Okay, and we want these trees to be in here. And that's good enough. We don't need a lot of stuff. Let's just make a couple areas for the character to wander around. We make a little loop up here, and then we can fill in a little water around here. Okay, that's good enough for now. All right. And so what we want to add in here are just a couple different rewards. And one of the things that we're going to be kind of thinking about as we add this, as far as game design and game development, we want to be able to have scenes that we can reuse so that we don't have to like add every little piece one by one. So a lot of the techniques that we're covering in the class, like, you know, the tile sets that we made last week and the player scene and stuff like that, is about making content that we can reuse so that we don't waste lots and lots of time, you know, drawing huge maps and drawing the same thing over and over again. And so one way that we can do that is to create a type of scene that can type of scene or script that can be used by multiple components. And so we're going to create a component that works with our apple item for the player to pick up, but we'll also use most of the same stuff with different art to create the extra life component that the player can pick up. So I'll make those first before we start coding. And so I'm going to put these in my scenes folder. So even though they're not levels, they're more like the player. Like the player is kind of its own scene that we can edit, but then we drop it into our level. So it's going to be like that. It's going to be a component that we can put multiple copies of. We can put it in multiple levels. And so if we change one aspect of the component, it will update in all of the different instances that you see it in any level or copy within a level. So to do that, I'm going to click on my scenes folder and go to new scene. And I'm just going to call this item and hit enter. And so I'm creating a completely new scene, but it's just going to contain my item, just like we have our player scene. And so I'm going to pick a 2D node. And actually, we want this item not to be a regular node, but we want it to be an area. So I'm going to change the node and type in area. And we're going to look for the area 2D. And so this is a really simple, it just adds a little bit more functionality than the 2D node, where we can detect if our player is inside of this area. And that's something that we need to be able to do to know when our player has collected the item. So I'm going to click change, and I'm going to change the name of this to item. And I'm going to use the apple as a generic item here. But you can make multiple copies of this item and add different types of items. So I have this little warning. And so if I have an area, I need a collision shape. So I'm going to right click and add a child node and find a collision shape. And I'm going to use that and click create. And then for the shape, I'm going to use a circle because my apple is basically a circle. So that looks good. And then let's add in our art. And so our items are animated. So just like our player, we need an animated sprite. If for some reason you have an item that's not animated, you would just use a regular sprite. So I'm going to go to the item and right click and search for an animated sprite and click create. And of course, once we have the animated sprite, we need to add some frames. So that's over in the inspector. I just click where it says empty and click new sprite frames. And then if I want to edit those, I just click on the sprite frames themselves. And this window is really big because I was editing some tiles. Let's drag it down a bit. And so now I'm going to start with my default, or I like to call it the idle state. So I'm going to rename this first animation. So I just double clicked on there. I'm going to call this idle. And so now if I want to add some frames, remember I can just click this little waffle button to add frames to my sprite sheet. I'm going to click on there and go to sprites, and I'm going to start with my apple. So I'm going to click on the apple and click open. Let's zoom in a little bit. And this is just the idle state. So I'm just going to use the first few frames of this sprite sheet, and the horizontal and vertical rows and columns don't match up. So I only have 3 columns and 3 rows. And so I'm going to click these first 4 frames and click add. And then if I want to see the preview of the animation, I need to click on the sprite sheet and turn playing on. And that looks pretty good. I just want to match up the collider a bit better. So I'm going to drag the collider down below the sprite sheet and make sure these match. So let's leave the collider. I'm going to lock it. And then I'm going to grab the animated sprite and move it. It's not letting me do that. So let's take the move tool. Oh, I have snap on. That's the issue. So I'll turn snap off. And now I'm just going to move it up like that. Okay, so it's actually pretty good. You don't want your art, remember we talked about this with the player, we don't want the art to go outside, or we don't want the collider to go outside of the apple. And that's just because if our player is, let me do a little drawing. Okay, so if our player is walking up to this apple, let's say he's like right here. If the collider is outside of the apple, once the player kind of crosses this blue area, then the player is going to collect the apple. And so it's going to look a little weird because it's going to look like the player arrived at the apple before they were actually there. So as long as we have the collider inside of this art, the player is going to be overlapping a little bit with the art before they collect the apple. We don't want to make it too small though, because then it would be, you know, the player might miss the collider. So that's pretty good. So we can leave it here, and then let's add, we need one more animation, which is when we collect the item. So I'm going to click on the animation plus and rename this collected. And then I'll click on the waffle again. It's already got the animation here. So I'm just going to click open. And it's already got my horizontal and vertical set up, so that's nice. So I'm just going to click these last 3 frames. And so that looks pretty good. The one thing I want to do is I don't want this to loop because I only want the apple to be eaten once. So I'm just going to turn loop off. And now the preview goes away, but that's okay. We saw that it was working. And I'm just going to turn the animation back to idle. Okay, so we have an item. We will go through this process again, but first we are going to write some code. So let's pause for a second. Any questions so far about setting up the item scene? All right, everybody's good?
Makes sense so far.
Cool. All right. Okay. So let's go put some of these apples in our scene, and then we will write some code so that our player can collect them. So once I have a scene, if I want to add it into my main scene, we did this with the player, but we only did it once, so we might not remember. So all we have to do is click on the scene. I want to make another child node to kind of organize these. So I'm going to add a node 2D. And I'm going to rename this node 2D items. And it doesn't really matter where this is in the hierarchy. I might put it like down here or something like that. It doesn't matter that much. And we can make it Y sort if we want. So it will, sort with the background. So it depends on what type of scene you have. For this type of top-down scene, we do probably want the Y sort on. So I'll just change this to a Y sort node. If you're making a side scroller, you probably don't need that. So I've got my items, and now I want to put them inside of this scene. So what I'm going to say is instance child scene. So that's what I do when I'm adding a scene that I created myself rather than a default Godot node. So I'm going to click instance child scene, and I can see the item scene there. I'm going to click open, and there we see my apple. It's kind of behind the player. So let's move it. I'm going to go ahead and lock up my player so I can't choose the player instead of the apple. Let's lock up my tile map as well. And now I should be able to move this apple. And I have snap turned on. So you can see the apple is snapping to these points on the grid. That might be okay. Depends on where you want to put them. But I'm just going to put one over here. And one thing I want to do is I want to add the functionality to my item before I make multiple copies of it. Because if I make a bunch of copies, but then I change the functionality, then I have to repeat that for all the copies. But actually, to demonstrate that, I'll just make a couple copies. So we'll see what happens. It'll be easy enough to redo it. So let's make the player have to move a little bit. Let's put a couple apples over here so he can go and find them. And so if I want to make multiple copies of this apple, I'm just going to right click on the item and click duplicate. And then I have two, I can drag one over. So at first it looks like nothing happened because they're in the same place. But when I drag one over, now it looks like I have two. I can also hit Command D if I want to duplicate an item or node without having to go over to the scene hierarchy and click on it. So I can do that and make a bunch of them. I can select all of those and duplicate them and make more like that. So if you want to have a bunch in your scene, that's a good way to do it. If I want to get rid of them, I can just click on it and well, actually I have to go over here and click delete and hit OK. I'm just going to delete these last few. Okay. So we've got the items. This is where we need to add some code to collect our items. And this process is a little bit more, takes a couple more steps than you might guess. And the reason for that is because we have this player component over here, and then we have our items over here. But we also have to keep in mind that we're on this one level, and our game may have multiple levels. And so if you remember a few weeks ago, we created this script. I'm going to open my scripts folder and open up global.gd. And we have this variable, the item count, which we're going to use to keep track of the items. And the way that we want to design our program is to have basically all of our different scenes and components be able to talk to each other. So we have our scene, which is like one level, and we may have multiple ones. So let's say this scene is level 1, and we have another scene that's level 2. And within our scene, we have other subscenes, like we have our player and we have our apples. And same thing in level 2, we're gonna have our player, we're gonna have some apples, we might have a life over here, we might have some bad guys eventually. This is my bad guy. And so in order for these guys to communicate with each other, we need to be able to talk to the global script. And so there's a lot of different ways to organize the code, but what I like to do is use what's called a scene manager. So I'm going to have a scene manager that's going to be in each scene, and it's going to communicate between all the different items. So if the player gets an apple, instead of just counting with the player, I'm going to tell the scene manager, hey, the player got an apple. And the scene manager is going to do some stuff. It's going to say, well, how many apples did they have? So it'll ask the global script, how many apples? And that global script will say, there are 0. And the scene manager is going to say, well, they just got one, so let's add one. And let's put that back in the global script. And so now if the player goes to scene 2, that number that we have, the number of apples, is going to stick with us. So everything that was in scene 1 is going to disappear. But with this global script over here, we're going to be able to know how many apples I had. And that's the same thing with lives or any other items that we might want to transfer from one scene to another. So our scene manager script is pretty simple, but it's also very important. So let's look at how to set it up. So I want to add in a node first, and it's got to be the first node in my scene. So I'm going to add a child node. It's just going to be a regular node 2D, and I'm going to rename it scene manager. And I'm going to move it all the way up here. And the reason for that is because in Godot, our scripts are called in order that they appear. So if I have a script here, which I'm about to add, it's going to call this one first, and then it'll call my player script second. So I want to make sure that my scene is set up before I get to my player script. And so that's why I put the scene manager all the way at the top. Okay, so now let's add in our script. So to do this from here, I can go to the script section for the scene manager. So I have the scene manager selected, and then I go over to the inspector and click empty. And I'm going to add a new script. And again, I want to make sure this is in my scripts folder. So I'm going to click on that little folder next to the path and click on my scripts folder. Or if I was, in my main folder, I just open scripts and click open. And template empty is fine. I'm going to click create. And cool. So now we have our scene manager. So let's take a look at the code in the lab before we start writing it. So there's a couple of things that we're going to do. We're going to get a reference to our player. And that's pretty much it. We'll add this stuff in a second. Yeah, we'll add this one. We're probably not going to do this one today. We'll add that later when we add obstacles. And this we'll add in a second. Okay. So the first part we want to do is get a reference to our player. And so what I'm going to do for this one, remember we have this thing called export, which will add the variable to our editor. And so we're going to export something called the player path. And this is just going to tell us where the player is. But to help out, whoops, okay, for some reason, key commands are different on Windows. Sorry about that. So the player path, we want it to know that what we're looking for is a node path. So when we say export, I also have to say var. But before I say var, I can give it a hint as to what type of thing I want to put here using some parentheses. And what I want to tell it to look for is a node path. So if I type in node, it'll give me a path. And that's basically just like a thing saying this is where the node is. So it's going to be basically what it does is we're going to be in the scene manager. And so when we get this player path, it's essentially saying the player's down here. So to get there, just go down here. And so that tells me where the player is, but it doesn't actually give me the player. So the next thing I'm going to do is say var player equals get underscore node. So that's a Godot function that will give me the node at this path. And I'm going to put player path in here. And so when I get that node, I get the player, but I also get everything that's part of the player script. So I can, anything that's inside of this player controller, like is alive and the speed, all that stuff I can now change or reference from the scene manager if the conditions of the game change. So if the player needs to get faster or die or other things happen, that's how I'm going to reference it. And then one more thing I'm going to add to this line of code. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the line, and I'm going to put in a new keyword here called onReady. And what this does is it just makes sure that nothing else happens before this code is done. So the reason I want to do that is because if I try to reference my player, but the player hasn't been loaded yet, like the art is still loading, I'll get an error if I try to do something with the player. So if I say onReady, I'm basically just saying wait until the program is running before getting a reference to this player. Okay, so that's a lot of different new things, but the result of all of that is if I go back to my scene and I click on my scene manager, you can see there's a player path in the script variable here. And if I click assign, what I want to do is it's going to show me my scene hierarchy, and I just want to choose the player. And so now I have a reference to the player. If anything happens in the scene, I can make the player faster. I can, kill the player. I can do whatever I need to do to the player. Okay, let's take a look at our code. Okay, so this part we're not ready for quite yet, so that's okay. We'll come back to that in a second. So now what we want to do is communicate between our item here and our scene manager. So when the player enters the item, then we want to alert the scene manager so that they know that we've collected the item. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the item, to the main item scene, and I'm going to add a script here. By adding a script here, it's going to be applied to all of the items that I've created within the scene. So I'm going to click on the main item area. And again, I'm going to go over to the inspector and look at the script and click empty, new script. And again, I have to click on this folder. It keeps taking me out of the scripts folder. I want to make sure this goes into the scripts. And I want to call this ItemManager.gd. Item.gd is fine, but I want to be a little more specific. This is my item manager. So I'm going to click item manager and say open and say create. Okay, so this one extends in area 2D because that's what type of item, that's what type of node my item is. And so now we're going to get to our signal. And so for this part, if I want to add a signal to an item, I just use the word signal. So it's kind of like VAR for a variable, but I'm creating a new signal. And the signal is just going to be item collected. And so when I hit the item, I'm going to send that signal to the scene manager. So how do we know that we hit the item? So this is going to go into another subject that we want to cover. If we look at our item, let's go back to the 2D mode for a second. So we have this little area. And if we click on the area and I go to the inspector, notice there's another tab here called node. And notice one thing, the item collected, that signal that I just created is now here. So this node tab is a list of all of the different events that could occur in the game. And you can see there's a whole lot of them. Like if I want to click, it says mouse entered, so I can click on something. There's a bunch of other stuff here. The main thing that we're going to look at is body entered. And what that is going to tell me is whether or not that's going to give me a little signal when the player actually enters this little blue area, because the player, remember, is a kinematic body. So if I double click on the body entered, it's going to say on item body entered, and it's going to allow me to connect this event to my code. So see, it's going to give me a reference to the area, and it even writes the code for me. It gives me this little on item body entered. And so that's fine. I might want to change that, but it looks good enough to me. So I'm going to click connect. And, oh, that didn't work. Let's try it again. Connect. There we go. I don't know why it didn't work the first time. Okay, so this created some new code for me. We rewrote this items collected signal, but now on item body entered. So when the player enters the body, we can alert our scene manager that our player has collected an item. So what we're going to do is say emit signal. Emit signal is basically like saying send the signal out, like if you were, honking your horn in your car or something like that. And then we're just going to say what signal we want, because there could be multiple signals. So we can look for our item collected and it'll put it in, or we can just type it out. So we put quotation marks for string data and say item collected. And so this is going to emit a signal when the player arrives at the item. So it is a little bit, there's a lot of steps to this, but let's see where we are. So here's our player, here's our item, and here's our scene manager, which isn't really in our scene. It's kind of overlapping the, here's our scene manager down here. So we don't see this in the scene, but it's running in the background. So when the player runs into the item, that's going to call this on item body entered, and that's going to emit a signal, and the signal is going to go to the scene manager, and then the scene manager is going to do whatever it needs to do with that. Okay. So we're getting close. Let's go back to our default scene. And now the last thing that we have to connect is we can look at our item, and now we have to connect our item collected to our scene manager. And so this is kind of what I was talking about before. Since I have a bunch of items, if I do this with one of them, it's not going to repeat. So that's why I want to duplicate after I've finished setting them up. So if I click on this item, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to double click item collected, choose the scene manager. It says on item, item collected. That's fine. I might take out one item because it's a little repetitive, but it doesn't really matter that much. I'm going to click this, and now notice it took us back to the scene manager. So that's a nice thing about Godot. It will actually write our code for us. So now we're back at on item collected. We're back in our scene manager. And here is where we can decide what to do with our item. So we need to add a couple other things before we can know exactly what we want to do. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to use the print function and say item collected. And what the print function does is it's going to print to this output. And so that's just an easy way to know that my code worked without before I actually have more stuff to do. So we're going to leave that for a second. I'm going to go back to 2D view. And so notice, as I mentioned, this item here, which is that apple at the bottom left, has this signal set up, but my other items don't. So I'd have to reset up the signal, or I can just delete them and recreate them. So let's delete these. And now if I take this item with the signal already set up and duplicate it, now it still has the signal set up. So that's one thing is it's not the end of the world. It didn't take me that long to recreate the items, but if you set everything up first and then add your items into the scene, you'll save a little bit of time. And so now I think we're actually ready to test. So let's play. Okay, so if my player goes over the item, you can see in the output, it's kind of small, but you can see that the item is getting collected. So that's pretty cool. There's a few things that we have to change here to make this really work well, but that's pretty cool. We've got things kind of all connected. So let's pause for a second. Any questions? All right, everybody's
Not
good?
right now, I guess. I need to get to that point, I guess, and see how it works with some of the things that I'm doing, just to see if if there's any trouble.
Okay. Yeah, it should be fine. All of the stuff I'm creating is also in the assets folder. So, you can create it from scratch, or you can grab it from the assets folder and just change out the art if you prefer to do it that way. Yeah, I just have a couple more things to add in the code. So let's just wrap it up, and then hopefully we'll have some time for you guys to try it out on your own. So a couple of things that we want to do with our item code before we add in our life item. So let's go back to our script. And so I'm going to go to the item manager. And so one thing that we want to know about the item is what type of item it is. That makes it so that we can use this code to be the same for a life or our apple or anything else that we might use. So I'm going to start by creating another export variable that's part of my item manager. And I'm just going to call this item_type. And I'm going to set the default to be apple because that's what I have right now. So I'll change this when I add my life item, but if I go back to the 2D view and click on my item and go back to the inspector, you can see over here in the script variables, the default item type is apple. And so that's something that I can send to my, my scene manager so it knows what type of item it's getting and it can decide what to do with that. So what I can do is I can actually send the item type along with this signal. So after item collected, I can add in a comma and put in item type. And what that does is it kind of adds in an argument. So if I go back to my scene manager, I can put that same argument right here. So I can say item underscore type, and then let's print that out along with our item collected statement for now. But before we test that, I'm going to go back to the item manager, and there's a couple more things that we want to add here. So one thing is that once our item is collected, we don't want it to be able to be collected again. And if the player is still inside the item body, it might trigger again. So this is going to be a member variable. And I'm just going to use var, what did I call this? This is in the collecting items. Item is collected. Okay. I'm going to say var item is collected. And this is going to start off as false. And so that will basically say, I haven't collected this item yet, so I am able to collect it. And so I'm going to add an extra line of code in here. I'm going to say if item is collected, but then I actually want the opposite of that. So if I want the opposite of something, I say if not item is collected, and then I put a colon, and then I have to move my signal over so it's inside of this if statement. So now I can say item is collected equals true, and this is a very common pattern in programming where I can basically, it's like a little switch. So once the item is created and I haven't collected it, the item collected is false. If I run over the item, if it's not collected yet, I'm going to collect it, but I also want to save that item is collected equals true. So that way I know that I collected the item, so I can't collect it more than once. So that's an easy way to keep track of that. And then I also want to play my collected animation. So I'm going to say $animated sprites. So remember the $, if I go back to my item view, the $, is just an easy way to reference a node that's inside of the node with the script. So I say $animated sprites, and I'm going to say .play, and I'm going to play my collected animation. Okay. So let's test those two components. I'm going to go back to my default scene and run. And so if I run over here, whoops, I got an error. Oh, I misspelled animated sprite. So if you see errors like that in your code, a lot of the time it's just if you misspelled something. And the error doesn't tell me that, but it doesn't know what this is because I misspelled it. So I'm just going to put animated sprite there. And let's try it again. I'm going to go over here. And so now my animation played, and it says item collected apple down here. Okay, so we're almost done with this, but one thing, notice that the apple is still actually there. And so we need to get rid of the apple. And this is something that is tricky in games because when something happens, we need to demonstrate to the user that the thing happened. So if we just remove the apple immediately, the user may not understand like, oh, I collected this apple. So we want to play an animation to show the user that the apple was removed, but then we also want to remove the apple once the animation is done. So this is another little event that we can add in here. So I'm going to go back to my item. I'm going to click on the item and actually click on the animated sprite, and then go to my node section. And there's an event here, animation finished. And so if I want to remove the apple when that animation is done, I can click on here and I can connect this to my script, just like I did with my signals. So this is going to say on animated sprite animation finished. And if I click connect, it's going to put that function in there. And so now what I want to do is I want to avoid removing my apple if the collected animation hasn't started yet. So what I'm going to say is if item is collected. So that lets me know that I have collected the item and the item collected animation is finished. So now I can say there's a special Godot function called queueFree. So queue is like our sort of like list of objects in the scene, and queueFree removes this item from that list. So if I say queueFree, then the animation will, or the whole apple will just disappear. So let's try all of that. So I'm going to walk over here, I'm going to eat the apple, and now it's gone. I can't collect it again. Okay, so this works with apples or coins or keys or extra lives, or, you know, if you want to collect a weapon or armor or a spell, anything that you would want to collect in your scene, you're going to have to use something similar to this. I think that's our full item code. We have one more thing to add to our scene manager, and then we'll be done. So let's go back to our scene manager. Okay, so the last thing I want to add is I need the scene manager to increase the number of items I have. So I'm going to go back to the scene manager script. I can click on this little script icon to go back here. And so now I want to say if the item that you collected was an apple, then I want to increase the global item count. So what I'm going to do is say if item underscore type, and then I can use a double equals to say that, you know, these are the same thing. And so if the item type is apple, then what I want to do is say global dot item count. So global is just a reference to this global script, which works because it's in my auto load in my game settings. So item count equals global dot item count plus 1. And then to test that, let's just print something. So we'll say print you have global dot item count apples. And I think that is everything for this bit. So we're almost done. Let's try this. Okay, so if I go over here, okay, you have 1 apples, you have 2 apples, you have 3 apples, you have 4 apples. Okay, so we don't actually see our item count because we haven't added our UI yet, but we know when it prints out you have 4 apples that the computer, the game knows that that's how many apples we have. Cool, so that's good. I think that's everything we need to do. We don't have a sound, so we don't have to worry about that. We can do that soon. Oh, we have to add the life. Okay, so we have one more thing to do, and then we're done. So this is actually pretty easy because we already did all this work with our apples. Now we just have to add the same thing, but we're going to turn it into a extra life. So I have my scenes, and I have this item. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate it and then just replace the artwork. So I'm going to right click on the item and I'm going to duplicate. I'm going to call this life and click duplicate. And so if I go into life, so there's just a couple things I have to change here because most of the functionality is the same. So if I click on the main item, I want to change this to life. And if in the item type in the inspector, I want to change this part to life as well. And then I just want to change the art. Everything else will work the same. So if I go to my animated sprite, I can go to my idle. I don't even need to delete the animations. I just need to delete the frames that I have and click on my frames and choose my life. Click open. Let's zoom in a bit. This is the idle. So I just need the first 3 frames. 1, 2, 3. And then if I click collected, delete the apple frames. and then choose the same sprite and just grab these last 5 frames. And then I don't want this to loop. Oh, it is already set like that. So I really don't have to do anything else. I just have to replace that art. And keep in mind that these exist in the assets folder. So if you go to the assets folder, oops. So in the default assets folders, there's scenes for both of these, the item scene and the life scene. So, if you want to set these up from scratch and kind of go over how this works in Godot, that's a good thing to do. But if you just want to add these into your project and replace the art, that's all you would really have to do is throw these into your project file and then update the art so that it looks like so it has your art in it. Okay, so let's add a couple life. Let's go to, I have these items. I'm gonna make another Y-sort. So I'm gonna add a child node, Y-sort, call this lives. That's not really the plural of lives, but that's fine. And I'm gonna do the same thing, add a child instance, choose life, click open. And now I have this life. Let's put it, whoops. Oh, I grabbed the camera. Oh, I have to lock up the player. Thought I already did that. Okay. Notice that everything is already connected, like the signals are already connected. The only one that's not is the item collected. The item collected. So let's move the life. Let's put it like over here. So he has to kind of get up there. Actually, I don't know if he can fit through there. So let's put it here and we'll deal with that later. And now I just have to connect my item collected. And so it's going to go to the scene manager. The one tricky part here is it's actually, so it says on life item collected, but what I really need is the same function because I don't want to write a whole new function. Although you could, it honestly doesn't really make a big difference. So on item collected. And so that brings me to the right function. So in that case, if you create a new function, you can basically do the same thing. And just rewrite this whole thing. But if you write the function that's here, it's going to connect to this function that already exists. And I can say if item type equals life. Now I can say the same thing except for using the global player lives. So I can say global dot player lives equals global.player lives +1. And I don't want the player lives to go over the total lives, so I can add in a check for that. So the total lives is 3. And so I can go to the scene manager and say if the item equals life, and I can say and global.total lives, we have, oh, whoops. That's not what I wanted to do. We have to compare the player lives to the total lives. So I have to say global.player lives is less than global.total lives. So if that's the case, we're going to add 1. We're going to print again, since we don't have any UI, you have global.player lives. Lives. And let's give our player 1 less life so we can actually see this work. So I'll give the player 2 lives to start. And I think that's everything. So let's give it a try. So there's my apples and there's my life. And yeah, you have 3 lives. So that all added up. All right. So now I just want to do a little bit of documentation. And so I know you guys cannot see the game bar, but just know that I'm using the game bar, and what I'm doing is hitting Windows. Well, actually, I want to start my scene first, so I'm going to hit play. And then I'm going to hit Windows G to open the game bar. And I'm going to turn off my mic and just then hit record. And then click on my scene again. And so I'm moving around. I just want to show that I can collect these items and that's it. So that's enough. I'm going to click stop. And now I'm going to open the game bar again and click on show all captures, and then click on the folder where the captures are. And so now you'll be able to see this captures folder. And I think this is the video that I just took. Yep. So that's what I can post on the Open Lab. For the scene manager and for the collecting items, there's a couple different sort of challenges to add. You can, for the scene manager, you can add another area. For the collecting items, you can add a third item. It's honestly kind of the same thing. So if you want to do both of these labs at the same time, that would probably make sense. So you could do one post that shows that you've worked on both of the labs. You basically just have to add a third item just to kind of demonstrate, knowing the process. So let's make a quick post. And so the category for this one is scene manager, and also item, collecting items. And so I'm going to say my items and scene manager. And let's see, can I drop this? I can't just drop a video in. I have to add a video block, and then I can drop this in. And I can just say this shows my character collecting items. And that's good enough. You guys can elaborate on that if you want to, but don't really need to say much more than that. If you do add to the code, you might also want to post any changes that you made to the code. I wonder if there's like a cool code block that you can use for this. Oh yeah, so you could use a code block. So if you want to, if you have some extra code that you added, you could use this like code block. So I'll just copy this. And so it doesn't really matter. It's just a formatting thing, but it'll display it in a normal format. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Yeah, so you could post your code like this if you want to show anything that you added in here. So that looks pretty good. I'm gonna click publish. And then there's my link. The Open Lab seems to be broken again. The posts are still working, but I'm not getting any notifications. So I may be a little bit late if you guys post stuff, but I will get to it. And if you've posted anything that I have not written a comment on, just send me a message on Discord and I will look at it. All right, I'm gonna stop recording.